Okay, so let's take a look at arguments. Today I'm going to concentrate on what are called consequentialist arguments. We haven't yet gotten to moral theories, but broadly speaking, there are three kinds of moral appeals you can make. You can make ethical appeals to, first of all, consequences. You can say, why is this action morally good? Because it has good consequences. Why is this action morally bad? It has bad consequences. Some moral theories are going to say that's all you really have to ask. But it's certainly one important kind of consideration. What really results from this? A second consideration is a set of things that Immanuel Kant is the philosopher associated with. And it's really a complex of things that kind of go together. So it involves respect for people's dignity, a conception of rights, a conception of justice. In philosophy, that tends to be called deontological, coming from the Greek word which means basically binding. Things that bind you, that are independent of consequences. But since that's kind of an ugly word, let's forget about it for the moment. It's really a question of rights and justice. And then the third consideration is virtue. Some things just seem virtuous, and other things seem to reveal flaws of character. And that's not necessarily because of their effects, nor is it because of somebody's rights. It just seems lousy, right? It seems like a person who does that is not a very morally good person, and so that action, we feel like, is not a virtuous action. So all those kinds of considerations can be brought to bear on this. Well, today I'm going to focus on the question of consequences and think about cases to be made on the basis of consequences. Next week, we're going to do something similar with the flip side and various criticisms. But for now, we're going to sort of look at the positive case based on consequences. And then next time, we're going to consider questions of rights and justice. So let's think first about questions of consequences. The classic case for capitalism and for free enterprise more generally is in Adam Smith. Adam Smith was one of the key figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, a contemporary of David Hume, for those of you with some philosophical background. Smith was in Edinburgh most of his life. He wrote a classic book called The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he lays out a great many economic arguments, really lays the foundation for the modern science of economics, but does that in a way that, among other things, presents a case in favor of free enterprise systems. He also wrote a work called The Theory of the Moral Sentiments, and we'll talk about that when we get to these questions of virtue, because he not only thinks that's central, but thinks one of the arguments in favor of free enterprise is that it encourages virtue. But we'll come back to that on Friday. For today, I just want to think about the consequences. Now, what is the case like? Well, basically, the argument is this. Free enterprise systems basically say you should look out for yourself. They can be described in a way as a form of egoism. Look, be prudent. Try to do well for yourself and act on the basis of your self-interest. Now, ordinarily, you might think, well, that's lousy ethical advice. Surely what is best for me is not what's best in general. But Smith says, don't worry. Self-interest, as long as it's in the right kind of setting, in the right kind of environment, is something that is going to lead to the best outcome for everyone. So we're really all better off if each of us tends to our own. Look after yourself, primarily, and as a result of all of that, we'll all be better off. So there are a number of famous quotations of Smith, and here is one of them. Man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor, and show them that it's to their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. Whoever offers to another a bargain of any kind proposes to do this. Give me what I want, and you can have this that you want. That's the meaning of every offer. In this manner, we obtain from one another the far greater part of the good offices which we stand in need of. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their own interest. And so the idea is, how do we get what we want? Well, we don't basically ask for charity. Things ordinarily operate in such a way that we each gain an advantage. And so here is the basic argument. If each of us pursues our self-interest, what happens? Well, first step is this. Each pursues self-interest. What are we doing? Well, we're trying to do as well as possible. But now, in a free enterprise economy, how do I do that? How do I do better? Good, exactly. I have to produce something that somebody else wants, right? Whether it's a good or a service, or in the case of what I'm doing right now, knowledge, I am actually trying to give somebody else something they value even more than the money that I'm asking in exchange. And so, in short, I try to do as well as I can by producing as much as I can that other people are going to value. So the second step is basically that if I do that, then I have to produce, I try to produce as much value for others as I can. And now it's important here that that value for others is as they measure it, right? What they consider valuable. It's not what I necessarily consider valuable. I may think I'm writing brilliant songs, but if everybody else says, yeah, that's stupid and trite, then I'm not really producing value for other people. And so I've got to produce as much value for those people by their own measure of value. I've got to produce things they want, that they think are valuable, are worth making the trade for. Now again, of course, this is going to only work if these conditions are satisfied. If I'm forcing people into this, maybe I'm not producing value for them. If they don't know what's happening, if I'm tricking them, then I'm not really producing value for them. They might think so, but they're going to find out pretty quickly that's not right. I sell them the Brooklyn Bridge, and they go there and they find out they don't own it after all. They're going to figure it out. So I try to produce as much value for others as I can, as they really measure value. Now, what does that mean? Well, put those two things together. If I pursue my self-interest in this kind of economic setting, I get, as a result, or at least I'm striving to produce as much value for others as I can. I might not succeed at doing this. Maybe I try to invent some great new thing and I never succeed. Or maybe I make a misjudgment. I think, actually, I'm going to produce the most value if I do this, and I would have been way better off doing something else. So I can make a mistake. And, of course, people on the other side can make a mistake. They can assign something a lot of value and then find out, oh, this doesn't have much value. They can go crazy buying Beanie Babies and then realize, wait, now I have a closet full of Beanie Babies. What am I going to do with them? So there are various ways in which things can go wrong here. Nevertheless, the tendency is going to be to actually maximize the community's welfare. And so Smith says, look, this indicates that people are going to try to, well, do as well as they can by making other people better off. That's the whole point of the system. People engage in these trades because each one thinks the trade is making them better off. So insofar as you let people do that, then to do well yourself, to get things, you have to produce things that other people want. Now, there is a famous quotation of his that I think is worth talking about. It goes on very long, so I'm going to abridge it because this is a page and a half single space. So I'm not going to read it all, but nevertheless, this is the place where he talks about the invisible hand. And that's an important thing to recognize when people talk about Smith's argument. He says we're all led as if by an invisible hand to maximize the welfare of the community. And that can sound mysterious. What do you mean by an invisible hand? But here's the idea. He says, everybody is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. It is his own advantage indeed, and not that of the society which he has in view. But the study of his own advantage naturally leads him to prefer that employment most advantageous to society. Okay? Why? Well, every individual necessarily endeavors to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest possible value. So everybody is trying to produce as much value as they can, and that is the sort of maximal benefit to the community. Now, that means, well, how do we make choices about how to do this? You're always trying to employ it in support of the industry of which the produce is likely to be of the greatest value, or to exchange it for the greatest quantity of money or other goods. You intend only your own gain throughout this, but you're led by an invisible hand to promote an end no part of your intention. And that's really the idea. So the invisible hand here is, you might say, his quick term for that process. You're trying to produce as much of value for you. You end up producing as much as you can for the community. And it's as if there is this invisible hand guiding you to do it. Of course, it's not some mysterious thing. It's your own attempt to think, yeah, what will people actually pay me to do? Where will I be contributing something? And in doing that, in finding the best place, you are really, essentially, if you try to find the spot where you are best off, that will be the spot where you're contributing the most to everything else. Well, are you convinced by this? What kinds of problems might we encounter thinking this through? Oh, okay. So one thing we've got is that this is talking about an ideal system where things truly are free. But what happens if we get fraud or deception? Then we can have all sorts of problems, right? And that can happen at a number of levels. I might be trying to produce as much value for others as I can, but as we said, that means value as they measure it. We might be misleading them about the value. I say, oh, listen, hey, how would you like to invest in this oil? Well, it's a sure thing. And of course, it's hopeless. I just drill a little hole in my backyard, and then I start selling rights to the oil when actually my yard is solid limestone. I can't even plant plants. It's 1 inch of soil over just rock. Well, very unlikely there's any oil down there. And so I might be tricking people. Or I might be misled. I might be thinking this is the way I can contribute most. This is the right career path for me. And I could be dead wrong about that. Maybe I'm deceived. Maybe I am simply confused and not informed. But in any case, those things can go wrong. This is describing, in a sense, what would happen in an ideal system, but the real world isn't ideal. People are acting on the basis of limited information. So if we think, what are some problems that arise? One of them is fraud, indeed, and deception in general. A second one is lack of information. Economists tend to assume that everybody's acting in a condition of perfect information. And of course, that's not the real world. Other issues that might arise, yeah. So yes, in order to contribute, you might say, wait a minute, I need a structure. I need something like a framework within which I can do this. You take a baby and you say, okay, baby, produce value for us. The baby isn't going to be able to produce much value, right? I mean, it's very cute. And so you can put pictures of the baby up and maybe, all right, people will smile at the little baby. But in general, that baby by itself isn't going to be able to do much. And so you might say, well, this all presupposes that we have a certain framework. Mill, in fact, in the Principles of Political Economy, lays out conditions like this. And he advocates Smith's argument. He thinks this is all correct insofar as it goes, but that it's very important that there be a framework for liberty, and does say the government has a legitimate role to play, not only in preventing harm to others, in establishing a rule of law and preventing deception, but also, and coercion, but also in the sense of building that framework. And you're right, it might involve education, it might involve a transportation network, it might involve helping to set up these financial institutions or these legal institutions. There's a lot of stuff that has to be in place for this to happen, for people to be able to make a contribution. And so there has been really, there's a sort of vision of government in John Locke and in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty also, of the government as a kind of night watchman state. It just has the job of policing things to keep people from harming others. But that's not really Mill's more considered position. And it hasn't been the considered position of any of the major parties throughout American history. All of them have agreed, yeah, some kind of framework is necessary. Now, what that framework is, how far it extends, what the government role in education, for example, should be, or in establishing transportation should be, or we talked about utilities earlier, those things are controversial. But still, that there is some kind of obligation to construct that basic framework for liberty is something that almost everyone has agreed on. You're right, we need, first of all, a certain level of competition for this to work. If I am the only person who has something, this gets us into that monopoly problem. I'm not forcing anyone, but on the other hand, they have no choice. And so this presupposes that we've got enough people competing, that we've got enough people making contributions that the system can work. If all of us have a monopoly on our things, then you might say, we've all got the power to coerce everybody else, and we've got problems there. And in addition to needing that level of competition, you mentioned the level playing field. Now, what exactly does that mean? People talk about that, but it's very tricky. And actually, later in the course, we're going to think hard about that question of what that could mean. What would it mean to have a level playing field? Good, right. People might try to establish some unfair advantage to themselves in this. And then I'm succeeding, not by virtue of producing value for others, but just because I'm managing to keep others down unfairly. And so you can imagine, I mean, to take that analogy seriously, imagine a football team that says, well, here's our stadium. We built it on a hillside. Oh, and by the way, we don't do this thing of switching quarters. You're always running uphill and we're always running downhill. You always say, well, wait a minute, that's not a very fair competition, right? And so there are ways of talking about this where we'd say, look, of course there can be ways of setting this up that distort the picture and give some people a strong advantage. Now, the reason it's tricky to define that is that presumably we don't want to say things like, well, yeah, look, it's not a level playing field. I mean, you know how to play musical instruments, and that person doesn't. We got to give them an equal chance to be a pop star. You might think, no, we don't. I mean, they aren't able to produce value, so if they can't even play an instrument, actually, they're not going to be able to contribute. So we don't mean level in all sorts of ways. Some people are going to be a lot better able to contribute in a certain area than others. But there are clearly ways of tilting this unfairly. I, for example, monopolize the market, or I monopolize sources of information in such a way that basically I pay all of the media to praise my product and to insult my competitors. Or I have my employees get on Yelp and give anonymous reviews of my competitors trashing them. Or, you can think of many ways. Or I discriminate against a group of people on the basis of all sorts of considerations that have nothing to do with how much value is actually being produced. So there are lots of ways of messing up the playing field in such a way that I end up not trying to produce as much value for others as possible. Instead, I'm trying to gain an unfair advantage. And a system that does that can be very bad. By the way, that can happen in organizations quite independently of these large-scale questions of discrimination or other things. It may be just a matter of currying favor with the boss, right? And it's like, yeah, the people who are buddies with the boss, they get all the raises, they get the promotions. It has nothing to do with what value they're contributing to the company, et cetera. So we're going to focus mostly on the sort of large-scale issues, but those kinds of small-scale issues are really important too, and they can be serious distortions. Opportunity itself is something that may or may not be present. I've been watching Ken Burns' special on country music and the history of country music, and it's amazing how many country stars grew up in very remote places. And we're in environments where they were desperate to get out because basically the opportunities available to them were very limited. And you might say, well, how did they end up becoming country music stars? Almost in every case by sheer luck and by dogged determination and traveling the country and going to radio stations and saying, hey, I recorded this record and all of this. But it made you realize how many of these people grew up in the Great Depression in remote places in Kentucky or North Carolina or Virginia or Alabama and just had very few opportunities. And of course that can happen not only because of the place you're born, but because of a system of discrimination, or it can happen because times are just very hard and there aren't many opportunities in the economy at the time you emerge. So there can be a lack of opportunity for all sorts of reasons. You might say, yeah, I'm trying to produce as much value for others as I can, but maybe I can't even reach others. Or maybe I just don't have here's what I would be really good at, but I don't have the opportunity to do that for all sorts of reasons. Okay, well, we're almost out of time. I want to mention one thing that is a technical result that has been interpreted as supporting Smith's argument. And I'll just, since I have this little spot on the blackboard free, I'll mention it here. It's known as the Arrow-Debreu theorem from 1954. And what it says is that under certain constraints, under certain conditions, a free enterprise economy produces a general equilibrium. And what that ends up meaning, well, it has a number of technical meanings, but from our point of view, the key thing is that it produces an outcome that is Pareto optimal. So, free enterprise, we might say, leads to an equilibrium that is Pareto optimal. What does that mean? Well, it means, and by the way, Pareto was an Italian economist after whom this is named. The idea is this: you can't make everybody better off than this outcome. You could make some better off, but at the expense of others. Now, that doesn't mean you're necessarily maximizing the value for the community, but it does mean that any further advance for anyone comes at a cost to somebody else. You might say, we'd all be better off if such and such. No. If you allow free enterprise to operate under these conditions, well, the outcome is Pareto optimal. You are together in a situation where you can't make anybody better off anymore without imposing a cost on somebody else. So there's no way for everyone to become better off under some other circumstance. So it's a good thing. It isn't the same as maximizing value, but it's definitely a good thing. Now, what constraints are there? Well, some of these are built in. For example, they're worried about lack of information, so that's a factor. Another constraint that is relevant is that we have to assume that preferences are convex. What that just means is that you reach a point of diminishing returns. And that does seem right on almost all values. I value having a toothbrush. Of what value to me is having a second toothbrush as a backup? Well, some, right? Something might go wrong. Once the toothbrush fell into the cat's litter box, that was bad. So it was of value to have a backup toothbrush. But suppose you say, well, here's toothbrush number 17 for you, Daniel. How much value does that have for me? Definitely much less than the first. So that's a pretty plausible assumption. But now there is one other important factor, which is transaction costs. This is what would happen if there were no transaction costs. In other words, if the cost of making our exchange is zero, beyond whatever you're paying for my item. But of course, is that right? No, in the real world, there are transaction costs. Maybe not at the school lunch table, but businesses have to advertise, for example. They have overhead. There are all sorts of ways in which transaction costs are not zero. And so this is a kind of ideal that both Smith and Arrow and Debreu are describing, that the real world can approximate more or less, but doesn't perfectly match.